this can, yeah. Yeah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Everyone, assalamu alaikum. My name is Anas Al-Tikriti. I'm a former president of the Muslim Association of Britain, and currently I'm sitting on its Shura Council. And it gives me great pleasure to be hosting today's webinar in which we commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution. I think it goes without saying that if we were to select the three top crises that are hitting the world today, I think that very few would disagree that Syria will be one of those three. Not only in terms of its scale, but also in terms of its longevity. No one, when the Syrian Revolution kicked off back in 2011, no one thought that in 2021, 10 years on, that we would be seeing that the revolution has changed face, has changed the essence, and has changed scale, and that we would see millions of Syrians living either as refugees within their own country or in neighboring and not so neighboring countries. No one thought that the damage and destruction that would be inflicted by the regime upon Syrian cities and towns throughout the country would be to the scale that we have seen. No one thought that we would see and the world would witness barbarism and havoc and chaos inflicted upon and delivered to the Syrian people such as we have witnessed and seen. There can be no question that we are in the midst of one of those crises that all of humanity recognizes, knows about, and is probably horrified by what is occurring. Today we want to talk about that, but we also want to address the Syrian Revolution and the case for Syria from both the political as well as from the legal perspectives. And we have two guests today that are very well equipped to speak about those two aspects. It gives me great pleasure to present to you Ubaida Nahas, who is the leader of the National Renewal Syria Party, as well as Ibrahim Ulabi, who is a barrister at Guernica 37 and also a board member of the Syrian British Council. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome, Ubaida. Welcome, Ibrahim. Thank you very much for joining us and for offering us this time to speak about this. And obviously, both of you are British Syrians or Syrian British Brits, either way, but you are extremely well placed, especially from your capacities and your specializations, to address the two perspectives that we're trying to address today. We aim to make this session as fluid and as dynamic as possible, and therefore what I'm going to do, I'm going to open up by asking each of you a question and allowing you 5 minutes maximum to open up, after which we will have a more dynamic exchange of questions and throw-ins and suggestions, and maybe if we receive any kind of questions or queries from our audience today, we'll be also presenting them to you as well. So without further ado, I'd like to start with the Ubaida. As I opened Ubaida 10 years ago, the Arab world was in the throes of the Arab Spring, and the world was enthused by what had happened in Tunisia and in Egypt. And all of a sudden, we had a clutch of Arab countries, including Syria, as well as Yemen and Libya, who were also witnessing their own formats of the revolution. Why is it, from a political perspective, why is it that 10 years on, that revolution still isn't any closer to removing the regime like what's happened in Tunis and what's happened in Egypt?
Thank you, Anas, and I would like to thank MAB for this invitation, which actually touches a very dear subject to my heart. I have been working in the political field in Syria for at least 25 years. And when the Arab Spring erupted back in late 2010, nobody was expecting that Syria would join. Actually, there were hopes that Syria would join, but there was no real expectation that Syria is capable of joining the Arab Spring. Nobody in the regime, nobody in the opposition anticipated that. In fact, if you even talked back then to experts on the Syrian subject in the UK or the US or anywhere around the world, they would say, well, Syria is out of question. The Syrian president himself, Bashar al-Assad, in an interview with an American newspaper early 2011, said that his country is not going to witness an uprising of any sort because he thought that his government's policies were in line with people's hopes and aspirations. Now, he was slightly right when he was talking about how the Syrians view the pan-Arab cases and how the Syrians look at how the Syrian regime supports the Palestinian cause somehow. But he was ignoring deliberately the fact that the Syrian people at the time were suffering badly from repression and the number of people who were in prisons back then. And we are talking about a country in the early millennium. We're talking in 2010, 2011. We're not talking about the 70s or the 80s. This is the so-called president that came to power in 2000, 34-year-old at the time. People had hopes that he would bring in change, modernization, and that he would bring in reforms. In fact, his propaganda machine worked very hard to convince people that this new young president is actually a president of hope. Regardless of the fact that he inherited Syria, Syria is a republic, yet we somehow were passed down from a father to a son, who became a president just because he was the son of the former president who ruled Syria for 30 years. Put together the rule of both the father and the son today, we're talking about 51 years together. Now, what happened is the regime was in disbelief at the beginning. The opposition was a bit surprised, but of course, they found a very good opportunity. As the revolution came a surprise to everyone, it was actually from the grassroots, it came from the ground. Nobody organized this, and there was a problem for everyone to understand. I remember in Western circles, they were asking who are organizing these mass demonstrations that took hundreds of thousands of people to peaceful demonstrations to the streets. Nobody knew. There were like new coordination committees that were created locally by young activists. And we are talking here about a new generation of Syrians who never knew any kind of government prior to Hafiz al-Assad, the father rule, who were born during his reign and who were raised by the Ba'ath Party, the ruling party, since 1963. But yet these people wanted freedom, wanted democracy. They wanted to say enough with repression, enough with oppression, enough with torture in prisons, enough with the killing of people. And unfortunately, the regime tried to look like it's looking into these demands, but it had another plan, which I probably will lay down later on when we come into more details. Basically, the regime narrative was very simple. This is a Western international conspiracy that is aimed to topple a regime just because it's against Israel and defending the Palestinian cause, which is absolutely not the thing. The case, the Syrians were not on the streets because of anyone in Washington or in London or anywhere else. And it actually said that because it's a conspiracy, they are now pumping terrorists to the streets, and these people are holding weapons, which was not the case, at least in the first few months. And there was a full plan that the regime used to release prisoners with a fanatic background to go out on the streets and then hold arms. And the regime wanted this to turn into a civil war. And unfortunately, 10 years on, we can say the regime succeeded.
Thank you very much, Ubaid. I think that that was an excellent opening for the discussion on the political perspective regarding Syria. But let me turn to Ibrahim Ulabi regarding the legal aspect of what we're trying to discuss today. And I think it goes without saying, Ibrahim, and I'm pretty sure that you would agree with me, that amongst the horrors that engulf the Syrian tragedy is the fact that the world community, the international community, in the 21st century, amid a humanitarian crisis, the scale of which we have seldom seen, has been absolutely inactive. Why is that? And is it that international law doesn't work anymore, or is there something happening that we are not aware of and that we should hold hope for? Over to you, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Dr. Anas, and thank you, Mab, for inviting me on to this, again, very kind of emotional subject, given that it's 10 years on from when the people took it to the streets in Syria. So let me break it down to a couple of different issues. So we have international laws, right? We have treaties, we have conventions that the West signed on to, created. They're mainly Western driven, right? The Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, the International Covenant on Human Rights, criminal courts, and so on. But what the problem that we have is that there is no kind of enforcement mechanism for all these kind of treaties and international obligations. So the West has been stuck. On one hand, it is their laws that are being broken. It is their laws that they've set that the Syrian regime and its allies, Russia and Iran and so on, are breaking kind of on a daily basis. So it's not like we do not have a mechanism to document, make clear the human rights case that's happening in Syria. And so the West is stuck, really. They either have to kind of let go of the laws that they created after World War II, mainly to kind of have some sort of world order, and say, listen, all of this did not work, and accept that this will fall apart, or to hold the regime accountable for the crimes that happened. You cannot have it both. You cannot ignore the crimes that were so well documented, even more than what happened in World War II and a lot of other conflicts. But they still say we have some sort of international order. And that is why a lot of states talk about accountability, talk about the fight against impunity, but we're also living at a time where there is a lack of political will to turn these things into action, mainly because Russia put its weight on when it comes to Syria, and there are very few states that would like to kind of confront that. But let me kind of shed light on a couple of human rights and legal issues linked to Syria. In my opinion, one of the biggest mistakes that we hear a lot of people talk about is that we need a political solution to the conflict, which gives the impression, I mean, I understand people who are focused on Syria know what that means, but it gives an impression as if what happened in Syria was kind of a debate about a constitution or tax laws, or, we agreed about this minister and disagreed about this minister, and that for that reason, 400,000 people, 500,000 people were killed, torture was taking place, and people were forced to displace, and chemical weapons were used. So it's not a political problem in the sense that you might think about Brexit or leaving the EU. It's a problem caused by policymakers and politicians, but the main kind of drive of it is a human rights centered approach because of the crimes that were committed. Hand on heart, if the parties to the conflict, and if the regime was only targeting people, who are armed, or when it turned into an armed conflict, we probably would have a different conversation. But the kind of theme of the Syrian conflict is the deliberate targeting of civilians, the use of chemical weapons, the forced displacement that took place. When the UN Commission of Inquiry, which was set up by the Human Rights Council, which now has Russia as a member in it, produces since 2011 to today almost 32 reports detailing the war crimes and crimes against humanity that the Syrian regime has committed. We cannot talk about, this is just a war, and this was collateral damage, and people die in wars, and wars are ugly. This is not the case in the Syrian situation. The amount of crimes committed, the range of crimes committed, the gravity of crimes committed, and so well documented, should make the human rights front the only front that Syrians should not be able to lose, because supposedly there's at least in theory a system on paper that should govern it. And a lot of people will be like, oh no, it's only on paper and there's no political will, and these, are in the international conventions and so on. But I'd much rather have the actions of the Syrian regime be documented as illegal against some sort of internationally recognized framework than be against it where it's not even recognized as a crime, or worse, where it's recognized as something that's permissible. So at least the international system and the human rights system has evolved to a level where I have a framework, I have a system of reference to call what has been happening in Syria crimes, to call what is happening as persecution. Because if you look at it, in a lot of areas of Syria, the war has stopped as an armed conflict. Why are refugees not returning? Why does a refugee live in a tent under racism, stateless, not able to bring their children into education, and not return to a quote unquote safe area? Because what they fled was not a war. What they fled was persecution.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. That was excellent. If I can come back to Ubaida, and I'd like to now start some sort of dynamic discussion on this. And there are so many issues that we can touch upon, but let me start with this, Ubaida. You've been part of several rounds of negotiations here and there that the world has witnessed. The question is that, as Ibrahim said, is it that the only channel that the Syrians can hope for is for a political solution, or is there another way out of this? And if that is the case, how do you see that occurring, especially in light of the weight being thrown by major powers in the world, such as Russia, as well as obviously you have regional powers also playing proxies against their adversaries in Syria and around Syria. So how do you see this panning out?
Well, for years now, at least for the past 5 to 6 years, everybody on the political level say that there's no solution but a political solution to the situation in Syria. Everybody announces that there's no military solution. Well, the reason being is that we are stuck in a balance where nobody can actually defeat the other side. Now, this happened because what started as a peaceful uprising by the people was quickly blown into a full-scale civil war because within 1 year, the regime had released from its prisons thousands, hundreds to thousands of people who basically believed in an Islamic ideology of extremism. Well, many people were affiliated to Al-Qaeda and other organizations, and they went out and started calling for an Islamic state. And this is why we started to see the likes of Daesh and ISIS on the ground. And they said, well, this revolution was actually to create an Islamic state by the people, which was not the case. The Syrians took to the streets, their demands that they wanted a democracy, they wanted change. The complex of the situation in Syria today is a big problem. We have too many players on the ground. I think there were some statistics saying that we are talking about more than 10 powers with soldiers on the ground, who have boots on the ground in Syria. And sometimes, I mean, some of them are like small European countries. But again, we have the Russians, the Americans, the Turks, the Iranians, the British are there. Everybody is on the Syrian ground today. Now, everybody's there for their own reason. There are some people who are in Syria to fight ISIS. There are people there to support the opposition. There are people to support the regime. Now, just imagine how a solution can be reached with all these players on the field. The fact is, everybody talking about a peaceful solution in Syria reference one specific document called the Geneva Document that was produced back in 2012. Now, that document was the result of US-Russian negotiations. And Hillary Clinton, the US State's secretary at the time, Secretary of State, said that the best we could get in the document was that we come with a transitional governing body formed of both sides, the regime and the opposition, in which both sides can veto whoever they want from the other side as members of this body. Now, as usual with all international resolutions, the devil is in the details. What kind of transitional body are we talking about? Is it a transitional government, like the regime would like to say? Is it, no, a completely new system, new regime, like a new body, just formed of new players, where the regime is absolutely excluded? There are too many, let's say, interpretations of the resolution. I was part of the Geneva negotiations between the regime and the opposition in early 2014. Now, when we went there, to be honest with you, we had 2 rounds of talks. Lakhdar Ibrahimi was the international delegate, the UN delegate to the Syrian problem, and he proposed serious talks. But after 2 rounds of talks, it was very obvious that we are not really having negotiations. Like both sides came to the table to prove that the other side, each side, wanted to prove that the other side is not in for a political solution. There is a problem in Syria. We have not had normal politics for at least 60 years now. We are talking about the last democratically elected government in Syria was elected in 1962. And it was toppled the next year, the following year. So since 1963, we had one-party rule, and everybody who was classified as a politician, I'm not talking about opposition figures, I'm talking about politicians, somehow were either sidelined or killed or detained. And of course, if you raise your voice as opposition, you get the same treatment. So Syrians are not used to talk to each other in a political context. And the regime, of course, does not envisage, it cannot imagine a situation where it actually shares power with others. And look, back in 2014, the regime only controlled less than 30% of the Syrian land. 70% was distributed between opposition, the Syrian opposition forces, the Free Syrian Army at the time, and Kurdish forces, and of course, ISIS was expanding at the expense of everybody. But the regime, even back then, could not accept the idea that there should be a political solution. Now, the opposition, on the other hand, were talking about a political solution. They were dealing in a very positive manner with the international community. But unfortunately, there was support enough at hand at the time to make them feel that we can win it. If we just prove to the US and the West that, look, the regime is not willing to talk, the Russians and the Iranians are actually supporting the regime not to talk, not to share power, then we will probably get in more support. There is an important shift that happened in 2015. The US administration at the time under Barack Obama decided between 2014 and 2015 that its priority in Syria is to fight terrorism and to get rid of ISIS. And this is when they started to form the international coalition to fight ISIS. And this is when many Western powers sent their troops into Syria. During that year, the Americans and the Iranians were in talks over a totally separate issue, which is the Iranian nuclear weapons. And by July 2015, the US and Iran reached an agreement. And you remember it was called the 5+1 agreement between the West and Iran, which would slow down the Iranian nuclear program. There were rumors, which nobody can prove, but there were facts on the ground that might support that the Americans under Obama basically handed over Syria to the Iranians. Now, 2 months down the line, the Russians also joined in September 2015 and they sent in their troops and they started bombing the opposition. So we had this situation where the opposition and the regime were fighting on the ground. The West came in to fight ISIS, which was fighting both sides. And then the Russians came in to fight the opposition, which was also supported by the Turks and Saudis, Qataris at the time, who were also trying to help the opposition regain its losses against the regime and the Russians. The Iranians were, of course, supporting the regime. Just imagine what was happening to the people. In 2 years, just in these 2 years, I think we had the largest number of displaced people in Syria. And today we talk about half the population displaced, either internally or as refugees overseas.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. I'd like to shift to Britain. I mean, if we are to believe the things that we hear on the news or the statements by politicians or the outrage, whether feigned or whether genuine, by the media, it must be that Britain has, you know, quite some leverage to do with the Syrian cause. But from your experience, and again, I realize your legal standing in this particular case, but where do you see this falling? How important is the position that the British government is taking, and you know, what can be done to either make this position either more effective or maybe change course if it's not heading in the right direction?
So we must remember that, you know, throughout UK politics, its relationship with Syria was very kind of up and down, let's say prior to 2011. And, you know, the UK holds a very close place in Assad's heart and in his family. You know, Bashar studied here. His wife is British. He met the Queen. There's pictures with him with Tony and Sherry Blair when he visited the UK on a state visit. But let's talk. So it wasn't always a problematic relationship, right? So they weren't always happy to expose the dictatorship and what is happening. But then in 2011, obviously with the Arab Spring, the UK took a position pro-Arab Spring, largely in Libya, in Tunis, in Egypt until the coup at least, and in Syria. And under David Cameron, the UK's position was very strong. It was very good. It kind of, you know, spoke against the crimes that were committed. It shut its embassy. It used its place in the Security Council. It's used its place in the Human Rights Council. It supported Syrian groups here. It facilitated the ability for us to go out and speak, raise issues in Parliament, and so on. So under David Cameron, it was kind of a pretty useful, active UK on this. But then obviously the changing point was 2013. 2013 is when the chemical attacks were used in Syria, in Ghouta. As you remember, there was a House of Commons vote whether to join the US or not in holding Assad accountable for that. And I actually remember this day very well, or that week, because I was actually in Aleppo that week. And I remember, you know, and because of, you know, scarce electricity, we turned everything off at the home just to kind of power a small kind of television set. And what I asked them to tune in to was not Al Jazeera, but, you know, the House of Commons debate for us to be able to see, will this happen? And I remember when then Ed Miliband played politics and strong-armed David Cameron, and then they lost the vote. And everything, I would say, went downhill quite quickly from there. This chapter in his book, David Cameron has this particular chapter on Syria specifically, where he talks about his position, what happened, and it's quite an interesting chapter to read. And then since then, the UK stopped taking a leading role, I would say, on Syria. They would follow whatever the US would do. It was kind of decided, you know, that this was a big political failure. We will no longer be able to do anything meaningful. But that didn't mean that it stopped caring about the file, at least public. And when I say caring, I wouldn't say just caring, you know, for Syrians. It's caring for its national interest because of the refugee crisis and what happened, and because of the extremism and the whole ISIS kind of rhetoric, and because it knows when it doesn't stand up, that, you know, that when and I say this often to ministers and politicians, that when Russia breaks these laws in Syria, it's not something sending a message to Syrians. It's sending a message to the UK. You're the strong power. I'm able to break these laws that you and I agreed on to, and I can get away with it. And there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. You know, and the next time chemical weapons were used, and the UK knows that, after Ghouta was in the UK. You know, and so they kept Syria as a file, raising it in the Security Council, raising it in the Human Rights Council, and so on, but no longer kind of leading onto it. So when the third or fourth chemical attack took place in 2017, and Trump bombed at that time, we remember that, you know, Theresa May joined the bombing, but it wasn't something that the UK kind of led on. And unfortunately, we had a problem that instead of the Labour at the time making it more difficult for the government to kind of accept this position, they were asking the government to do less rather than more. So when the government wanted to act, they'd be like, no, don't act. We need to wait. We need to see this. We need to work through the UN, which is a fancy statement that everyone says to actually, you know, do nothing and hide by the Russian-Chinese veto that was used over 20 times in the Syrian context to stop any sort of humanitarian, human rights, or political movement. Post-Brexit, I would say now, the UK has a chance now, when it's kind of looking for its foreign policy, to you know, kind of re-energize themselves again in the Syrian file. It's a country where, you know, it's surrounded by UK allies or countries of interest from the north, south, east, and so on. It's a country it has highly invested in. It is a country that there's a strong Syrian community here. It's a country where it can stand up to Russia, Iran, and you know, prove its alliance to Turkey. It is a strategic country, and it's even you know, even for party politics, it's a chance for the current kind of government leadership to show that they might manage to do something that the previous government was not able to do. And it's a chance also for Labour to be able to stand their ground. And now with the new leadership also, they have seen significant improvement when we met with shadow ministers to push the government to do more. So overall, I would say, although I feel the UK has taken a back stand on Syria, there is space to do more if we do keep Syria on the table through emailing our MPs and you know, getting you know, involved in our parliamentary party groups and so on.
In the last 15 minutes that we have, and we unfortunately have far too little time to discuss something of this magnitude, and we could literally go on for a couple of hours more at least. But unfortunately, because of the time constraint, I'd like to focus now with both of you on, okay, so ways out. What does the future hold? And I'm talking here about the near future. What does the future hold on a political level, Ubaida, particularly when we're talking about you know, the revolution itself? Does it have any is it of any validity to continue to speak of a revolution? And if so, what prospects are there for that revolution to actually achieve its goals by attaining freedom for the Syrian people? And also, once again, about Britain and the international community generally, especially that you're in that particular field, what do you think should happen?
Well, there is an ironic situation in Syria today. If I tell you that inside Syria, people can still take to the streets and chant against the regime, many people might find this hard to believe. But on 10% of Syrian land, there is an interim government that is appointed by the opposition. This actually shows the situation where Syria has headed. Today, we have three Syrias, not one Syria. Syria is divided into three influence regions. The regime controls around 70%, 60-something percent of the ground, and there is 10% controlled by the opposition forces, and also there is another 25, 30% to 30% controlled by Kurdish forces, called Kurdish. They call themselves the Democratic Syria fighters or troops. Forces. In the two regions where the regime is not in control, people can openly, of course, accuse the regime of anything, and they all somehow celebrated the the 10th anniversary of the revolution. Now, under the regime-controlled areas, things are not as rosy as the regime would have hoped for. There are many reasons. First of all, the new Caesar Act imposed by the US government last year resulted in a very deep economic crisis in regime areas, because now any government, any private sector actors who try to trade with Syria might come under US sanctions because of trading with a government that is accused of using chemical weapons, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. But at the same time, the US is only, so far, has only used this as, I don't know how to say it, as a leverage tool, yeah? It's not an active policy. So under regime-controlled areas, people can still go out. That many people demonstrated to commemorate the 10th anniversary. There are areas in which some of the former Free Syrian Army forces that were taken under the Russian arm, and they were somehow joined, they joined the Syrian army, but they are reporting to the Russians, not to the Syrian army command. So in these areas, in Daraa, for example, in the south, the regime is not fully in control. But it seems like Syria will remain fragile for a long time for the foreseeable future, because when we say the north under the opposition is protected by Turkey, Turkey also now has a stake in what happens in Syria. It has troops on the ground protecting these areas. And every now and then you hear the news about the Russians bombing the north and the Turks retaliating, or the opposition retaliating. Now, I don't think there's a complete political solution coming any soon. What we might have is this situation will keep evolving into let's say a long-term conflict that might start to have some political, minor political solutions here and there, but there will not be a full solution for a long time. A momentum has to be built, and it will take time. Unfortunately, the opposition today has only one ally on the ground, which is Turkey. For the rest of the 130 Friends of the Syrian People governments that existed in 2011, 2012, including the US, the UK, and most of the EU, they are not there. As Ibrahim said, the UK took a back seat, and the US is doing almost the same. It's just using the sanctions. And of course, there's an international debate always about using US sanctions and how effective they are. They used them against Iraq for 12 years, and then nothing happened. So they went in and toppled Saddam Hussein. So again, nobody expects that this will take Syria anywhere. Unfortunately, I can't think of any positive role the UK can play. Since 2013, that infamous debate in the House of Commons, and how Ed Miliband, unfortunately, and the Labour Party stalled UK intervention to stop the use of chemical weapons on civilians. We had 2,300 people killed in one day, most of which were children and women. And everybody can remember these horrific images. Yet the House of Commons debate was the significant moment at which any hope of any intervention against oppression in Syria was killed. And unfortunately, the UK since has not done enough to overturn that. And I don't think it's going to do anything soon, because let's remember that Syria does not fall under a British influence if we talk about how the world order operates. I mean, it's more of a French influence area, or let's say Russian, Iranian over the past 30 or 40 years.
Ibrahim, same question. How do you see the future panning out, particularly from the legal perspective? I mean, you spoke about even during the days of David Cameron, when there was a sense of urgency regarding Syria, a sense of support, but we never saw any particular pillar of the Syrian regime being sanctioned, being targeted. We never saw Assad, the president's wife, being somehow barred from entering the UK. She still has an estate over here. Her family function fully as far as we are aware. So how do you see the legal channel panning out in the near future, particularly that Guernica 37, the firm that you work with, has submitted papers to the ICC. How do you see this panning out in the next few months, hopefully, but if not, then at least in the next few years?
Well, the developments on the accountability side, or let's talk about it as the fight against impunity in that sense, because it's not just about judicial acts, it's actually improving quite significantly over the last couple of years and even in the last couple of months. So we've had a couple of cases against ex-regime officials in Germany that, it goes beyond just the individual people, because there's a bit of debate about these people themselves. But what it did expose is that we have a German ruling now on torture being industrialized in Syria, coming from a German independent court. We have arrest warrants coming from France and Germany against very senior regime intelligence officers that are involved in mass torture. We have a move from the Netherlands and Canada to take Syria to the International Court of Justice again over torture. We have strong sanctions regimes from the US, UK, and EU against regime individuals, targeted sanctions against those people for some time now, and it's growing. The UK, for example, adopted an autonomous sanctions regime, particularly only for Syria. They've created actually secondary legislation within the UK legal system focused on Syria, and then on the anniversary of the uprising, they sanctioned another 6 kind of individuals. And sanctions are not just they're not an alternative to other accountability tools, but at least they're a good signaling message that what's happening is not acceptable. So we're seeing cases, judicial cases, and international legal cases and sanctions against a lot of these individuals on one hand. On the other hand, I was actually positively surprised by the amount of statements came from European and US and UK leadership on the anniversary of the uprising, all talking about accountability and the crimes committed by Assad. I thought they would use that to say, it's been going on too long, let us just end it, turn a new page, something along these lines, which they could. But Dominic Raab came out on a specific, recorded video just for on the kind of uprising anniversary, and said, accountability for the people for chemical weapons and so on. So at least that helps cement that what happened in Syria is just not just a war. This is not just collateral damage and so on, but these are war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this is actually a result of a lot of lobbying from Syrian groups and victim organizations who have now mobilized, specifically in the last couple of years after they came to Europe, the UK, they settled, they were able to kind of, take a breath a little bit of what happened. And now we have a lot of victim associations, people who were tortured themselves, former detainees, people who don't know where their wives or husbands or daughters are, leading the accountability efforts to at least stop the normalizing with the Syrian regime, or for it just to kind of, be dismissed as a conflict or a political solution that we can just, turn an eye on. So I am hopeful that, on the human rights and the accountability front, mainly led by Syrian men and women, that, at least we will not let, in light of all the disinformation that is happening, the narrative and the history to be written that, that Bashar al-Assad and his allies are not war criminals.
In a minute, each of you, if you were to send a message to the British government as well as to the British people, specifically, besides thoughts and prayers and donations, inshallah, much of that is happening. I'm talking about practical steps, things that people can actually contribute towards the resolution of this particular crisis and the salvage of freedom and dignity for the Syrian people. What would that message be? In a minute, Ubaida.
Well, the British public cannot really do a lot to the Syrian cause other than, as you said, donations and help. But as for the British government, I think, the UK is one of the major powers in the world. It's one of the big 5 in the UN Security Council, and it has not done enough. And sometimes I think the UK is just retreating on every level. Now, I would like to see a UK role in, first of all, not allowing the regime not to just continue its atrocities, but also not to survive after these atrocities stop. So, as you said, there's the British link in Syria today. The First Lady is a British citizen. This actually is something, and something has to be done about this. The regime managed to smuggle a lot of its wealth to the UK over the past 10 years. And you mentioned that the First Lady's family have an estate in the UK. Actually, this estate has grown. And the UK government can see that. Now, as the UK also puts people accountable when it comes to extremism and terrorism, I think it has to do the same when it comes to atrocities and war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Thank you very much. Ibrahim?
I would just say, it was super sad, both, over the last couple of years, both at the government level and the public level, to see the defeatist mentality. The UK, as Ubaida has said, is a power. It is strong. The British people have a voice. They have influence. And Syria matters not just for Syrians, but it matters for pure UK interests. So what I would say is that, people should not give up and should not feel that the Syrian conflict is over. It is not over. There is a lot that you can do by getting, your government more effective on Syria. And to the UK government, I would say that, if I would kind of choose one priority, is to link Syria and see Syria not just as just one conflict, but see the proxies, put pressure on the allies of the regime, Russia and Iran and so on, to be able to get the meaningful change that we can get in Syria, which will serve British interests.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Ibrahim Ulavi and Ubaida Nahas. This discussion was a fascinating one, and albeit it was extremely brief, we could have carried on, but unfortunately time was short. But I'm pretty sure that we'll revisit this. There's much to talk about and much to discuss, and I'm pretty sure that both of you will have much more to say. So, but our thanks and gratitude for you. To both of you for joining us today, and also my thanks and gratitude to everyone who's joined us either on this Zoom chat or on our YouTube channel. Let's keep this work up. I mean, our stand is unshakable when it comes to peoples of the world moving in order to attain their freedoms, their dignity, their democracy, their liberation from the clutches of oppression of any sort. And that goes for Syria as well as Yemen and Libya and many other countries around the world where the peoples are actually fighting for their futures and for their dignity. So thank you very much for joining us, and watch the space for future events. Thank you so much to everyone, and from me, Anas Al-Tikriti, and from the team at the Muslim Association of Britain. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
السلام عليكم.